Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. This week we'll be looking at summer 2008, starting with an unexpected album, Yage, The Woodlands of Old. Release date 11th of May 2008, digital, 19th September 2008, CD. 9th of March 2008 and another massive update of Ever So Old digital. Among the forthcoming releases listed is Woodlands of Old by Yage. Quite a surprise given that the name hadn't been used as a lead artist for material recorded after 1992. A clip of the title track on Ever So Old's MySpace page was enough to convince everyone that this wouldn't be a continuation of the sound of Fuzzy Logic, but a new musical project entirely. A list of titles was given by the band's management in the weeks that followed, with the album eventually being released as part of a surprise update to Ever So Old Digital in May, which involved a major overhaul in the site's design. A much needed one too. The official description given: from the deserts of the Middle East to the rainforests of Brazil, odd rhythms, eerie melodies. In many ways, the Woodlands of Old is a typical early Ever So Old digital release. Probably a little bit too long, with a few too many tracks and gaps between them all. The main difference is the sound, something which was worlds away from anything put out on the site before. Although there are synths used throughout the album, a significant amount of the instrumentation is sampled or performed. Layers of percussion, electric and acoustic guitar, bass, violins, sitar, strings, piano and voices. Although that suggests something of an Amorphous vibe, it's pretty different, with a much darker sound and a generally looser feel, with tracks ranging from tribal ambient to avant-garde jazz in style. The actual lineup is not listed, although the album is considered to be largely the work of Brian. His neighbour, ex-Propellerheads member Will White, plays drums and is credited as co-writer on the Yage letters. Many of the instruments will have been played by Brian, with others no doubt sampled from records and probably the hours of recordings made for Amorphous albums. The closest thing to it before this point is probably the San Monta tapes by Heads of Agreement, with a similarly dark rural atmosphere and emphasis on acoustic instruments and percussion, although the two are still stylistically pretty far apart. For once, the track titles feel very focused, largely describing odd natural scenarios, often woodland based. This is at odds with the largely disparate sources of titles on older Ever So Old albums, and helps with the atmosphere of the record, although it does make the titles themselves a tad less distinctive. I can never remember them all. Perhaps unsurprisingly, with 30 releases in the first 18 months of Ever So Old Digital, many got overlooked, and this is often one of them. It's not an album you regularly see referenced within the fanbase online, which is a shame as it is tremendous. It's clear that the group thinks so too, as it was the first side project work to get a physical release, coming out on CD 4 months after the digital version. Quite surprisingly too, it was largely expected to just go alongside the other side projects as digital only. I've seen copies in shops, so it's definitely out there, but deserves a lot more recognition. The CD art is a continuation of the style of the marvellous front cover, featuring paintings by Brian's wife Lisa Bartlett. The images are incredibly atmospheric and heavily textured, a blur of abstract imagery and identifiable figures, the front looking like a tribal painting, the booklet featuring a skeletal figure in front of a bridge, a painting of a bird and a cat, an incredibly eerie image of what looks like a screaming face, a traffic-filled street, and others. Brick-like textures show through some of the images, giving them a worn look. It's a shame that some of them are slightly pixelated, as this does the wonderful paintings no justice. Oddly, the disc art features the old 1992 Yage logo from Fuzzy Logic and some wireframe images, kind of at odds with the raw, tactile imagery on the rest of the art. The graffiti and splatter logo is on the disc, alongside a very small EBV and exploding head combination. The Woodlands of Old. The Woodlands of Old opens on its title track, and it's a great scene setter, kicking straight in with a rolling drum beat and an eerie organ melody. Despite being constructed in an electronic fashion, it sounds very much like a live band, the drums playing different fills regularly throughout, a guitar solo following, as well as what sounds like a zither or dulcimer melody. There's an eastern stringed instrument, possibly a sitar or similar, as well as an unidentified reed instrument. Where all these instruments came from, samples, Brian, members of the Amorphous band, remains unknown, but it's a wonderful collage of different sounds that work incredibly well together. The piece was included on a 2011 cover mount CD with Mojo magazine, tracks selected by Noel Gallagher. An odd question from Forest Bird. The second track on the Woodlands of Old moves things into more abstract territory, percussion clattering away almost at random as opposed to holding a steady groove. Backwards guitar holds the attention at first, but a violin melody soon comes in to give things a slightly more melancholic touch, and then some kind of bagpipe instrument. The track is also filled with utterly weird, difficult to describe noises, some clearly electronic, others more organic, typical FSOL in that sense. What sounds like mumbling and chanting voices fills the background at one point. A very strange track and one with a very fitting title. From Thunder That Shakes, a sinister Yage track filled with danger. Opening with sinister synth chords as well as layers of odd percussive noises, the track kicks in with a huge booming timpani and a fast jazzy drum loop. A Middle Eastern sounding reed instrument, maybe a zurna, comes in briefly to add some further chaos to proceedings. Electronic noise and reverse speech, I've tried playing it backwards, no idea, closes the track. Once again, the title is spot on, a dark, stormy piece. The Yage Letters. Named after William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg's controversial book of letters, the Yage Letters features drums by Will White, whose presence is large enough for him to receive a co-writing credit. Electric and bass guitars form the melodic part of the track, while White goes mad on the drums, adding countless layers of percussion. Flutes appear briefly in the second half. Drums are fed through some bizarre modulation for the outro, an intense psychedelic sounding track. The Hunter's Moon. Taking the Woodlands of Old into jazzy territory, the Hunter's Moon features a brushed kit, airy piano improvisation and dark brass notes. As the track goes on, the now familiar world elements of the project come in with chanting tribal voices. A simple but incredibly effective piece of music with a nocturnal mood matched by the title, probably my favourite on the album. Mounting Cloud Descending. Built around a drum loop that never quite gets into a groove, Mounting Cloud Descending is another dark track. Choir samples, more reverse guitar, organ notes and scratchy violin are all present. It feels slightly more repetitive than a lot of the tracks on the Woodlands of Old and is maybe one of the weaker pieces on the record, although by no means a bad track at all. Procession. One of the most atmospheric and visceral tracks on the Woodlands of Old, Procession is a thoroughly fitting title, with the marching drums soundtracking an eerie parade, backed by strings and creepy synth melodies, a piece that could easily fit on a film score. Crow Hushing the Floating Woods. Built around an old synth loop, Crow Hushing the Floating Woods is a hypnotic track that ties together the more electronic side of Yage with layers of heavy percussion. A haunting, echo-laden synth melody appears at various points, adding atmosphere, while the drums are pushed through electronic effects in the middle. Maybe the closest to 90s FSOL that the Yage project comes. The Mahogany Tree Sheltered. Taking a break from the percussion-heavy rhythmic sound of the album's first half, The Mahogany Tree is a brief interlude based around improvised acoustic guitar. The track is recorded in a lo-fi fashion with the room's background ambience and chair creaks clearly audible. As the piece moves on, odd gurgling noises are introduced, adding a surreal feel to the piece. He Laughed Himself to the Centre. Another Woodlands of Old track with a thoroughly fitting weird title. This is a very strange sounding track. It begins with largely unmelodic analog synth noises before an oddly staggered drum beat comes in. This is followed by a range of odd sounds, bells, a strange organ melody, bizarre creaks and whines. The track goes on for much too long for my taste, but the atmosphere it creates is totally unique and very strange. Unsettling Sky. An ambient interlude built around lonely synth notes and reversed sounds. Gentle percussive hits and subtle bursts of distortion are built up throughout the piece, keeping the atmosphere on the tense end of things. Humbled Before Your Presence. Humbled Before Your Presence returns to the more Middle Eastern sound of the first half of the Woodlands of Old, with tribal sounding percussion, an oud-like stringed instrument loop and mangled reed instruments. Layers of effects and synths are added to create a bizarre cacophony of sound. Who had such foolish care? Another jazzy track here, more brushed drums with a fretless bass riff leading the piece. A field recording of insects and birds runs throughout the track, while guitar and flute notes punctuate the looser feel. Bass melody is quite melancholic, adding variety to the largely more sinister atmosphere of the Woodlands of Old. Circle the Corn. Back to the unsettlingly sinister vibe again with this track, built around a loop that always makes me think of some sort of demented circus music. Tinny percussion, mellotron strings, piano, odd synth notes, some explosive cymbal crashes, overdriven guitar chords, all combining to create the feeling of something thoroughly unsavoury marching inexorably in the listener's direction. Centipede. Another jazzy track featuring Will White on drums. Acoustic bass joins White's swinging playing, over which an electric guitar theme adds a mid-20th century spy film vibe. Only the backward samples give away the fact that this isn't a live performance by a jazz trio. Dry Wind Blown. Moving away from the western sounds of the previous few tracks, Dry Wind Blown is the Woodlands of Old in its most heavily Middle Eastern mode, with bagpipes, flutes and reed instruments combining with loose sounding drums. Synth chords add more atmosphere in the second half, an incredibly evocative piece that sums up the deserts of the Middle East part of the album's description in both music and title. Haxal's Dream. No idea who Haxal is, but his dream is an ambient one with none of the Woodlands of Old's usual heavy percussion. Instead it's built around 4 minutes of subtle electric guitar playing fed through various delays and reverbs to create a pensive nocturnal atmosphere. Some electric piano and vibraphone notes near the end add a touch of variety. Heavily He Flies. Will White's third and final contribution to the Woodlands of Old, and another track that sounds like a live band. White lays down a solid groove, over which comes a quirky synth improv, the zither, dulcimer and plucked melodies from the album's title track, as well as some electric guitar. It's a strange piece and lacks some of the atmosphere of the bulk of the album, feeling instead like a bouncy studio jam. The final minute is focused around a flute melody. The Dark Pines. An ambient track moving away from the drums once again. Washes of synth noise, odd bleeps and atmospheric background sounds are the main focus of this bleak track. It sounds very much like something that could be used as a between-track environment on an FSOL album. The Sun Lends Warmth and Comfort. A subtle piece with violin melodies over slow percussion and backing drone. A fairly simplistic track and one that helps bring the album towards a gentle close. The slow-moving skeletal drums are very similar to those found on the Heads of Agreements of the San Monta tapes. A Welcome Beneath Night's Darkness. A fittingly weird end for a weird album. A Welcome Beneath Night's Darkness eschews the acoustic fourth world feel of the rest of the Woodlands of Old for a minute of bizarre dark synth noises. FSOL and album closers always a weird relationship. The Future Sound of London, the Electric Brainstorm 1, Proton Radio, 16th of June 2008.
The Future Sound of London.
Okay, let's go.
Transmit.
The Future Sound of London. The Future Sound of London.
You've just joined the virtual universe.
This marks the start of the period I most enjoyed being an FSOL fan. The previous year's releases had been both overwhelming and lacking a certain attention to detail in places which, combined with me finishing my degree and starting full-time work, meant I felt slightly distanced from what was going on. This mix came along at a point where the release rate began to slow down a little and my life began to calm down. And not only that, this was a proper new FSOL mix with a theme and a part of a new series, not created just to promote a compilation like Volume 0.5 a couple of years before. After a lot of archived releases, this really felt like new FSOL on the radio again. The mix was broadcast on the online station Proton Radio, the group's first appearance on an online-only station. The show begins with some 1996 tour-esque opening samples, You've Just Joined the Virtual Universe and so on, as well as the usual array of samples before throwing in Detonation, then simply known as Weird Explosive 2-inch tape reels version. It's a knockout way of starting a show with 2 minutes of utter chaos. This is followed by Hocusing for Beginners by the Advisory Circle. This kind of hauntological sound associated with the Ghostbox label is something I mentioned in reference to some of the early FSOL digital releases, and this is where the link becomes obvious with the first of several pieces from that label to feature in FSOL mixes. The track closes with the Have You Ever Had the Feeling You Were Uncertain sample, most known for its use on the 1996 tour. After a brief interlude from Mount Vernon Arts Lab and Nocturnal Emissions, a second Ghostbox track comes along, the gloriously 70s synth music inspired The Hidden Door by Belbury Polly. It's followed by the first known track by EMS Piano. The vessel largely washes of EMS sounds. With all the analogue synth work going on here, the vibe is very different from 90s FSOL, an era defined by sample collages and, when DJing, electronic music largely from the 80s and 90s, as well as occasional 60s experimental pieces. Up next is another FSOL digital exclusive, Open Door, then listed as an unreleased FSOL track, but later reassigned as part of the Jazz Mags project, although the track remains unreleased. A slow breakbeat with chopped up guitar and muted trumpet improvisations on top, it feels like an update of the ISDN era. A Deepak Chopra sample plays, showing that the Amorphous era has fed into the new FSOL, in a small way at least. Similarly, the stings and watermarks announcing the band name are spoken by people rather than robotic voices. After a glitchy spoken word piece by experimental turntablist Christian Marclay, over which a mixture of environments from 1993 and 96 are overlaid, it's time for an unreleased Z-Box track, It's Too Late, then titled Out Pot, teasing the long-promised third volume of the 1984-87 series of albums. A sample from the movie Nights leads into Yage Rhodesia, Insulin, called Hallucination Sunset Strip at the time. The use of the Night sample is only the first of several examples in the mix, and makes me wonder whether this was a deliberate tie-in, a use of familiar samples to act as a continuity from the 96-97 tour, or whether it was simply because the band hadn't been collecting many FSOL suitable samples in recent years, and as such these older ones were simply the closest to hand. Intriguingly, Yage is overlaid with Amorphous era synth sweeps and a cosmic space music spoken sample, once again tying the two projects together. Yage closes with some Dead Cities era environments, underneath which a piece of minimal electronic music by David Whittaker from a free net label release is played. The appearance of a net label track shows an interest in finding new underground music in the FSOL camp. After a brief appearance of a Delia Derbyshire track and a groovy piece by Holger Suke, at the time only available as a rare promo, the mix heads back into Dougans Cobain territory with an interesting appearance of an Amorphous Androgynous track in an FSOL mix. Riders on Circadian Rhythm is one of the most FSOL sounding Amorphous tracks, so the choice is logical. It closes with spoken samples from A Tiny Point of Light and some more night samples, and then Illflower-esque section of Environments Part 1, followed by a snippet of a radio interview from the 90s in which the interviewer meets Brian outside Earthbeat. This is followed by an unreleased Amorphous track called Flickers with Dilruba, sitar, wobbly synths and dramatic piano. It's a bizarre piece that doesn't really sound like anything else in the released Amorphous catalogue, and is supposedly from an album called Amorphic Alternatives, maybe another name for the Amorphic Archives that's never been released. 1996 environment Kawa acts as an intro to an unreleased 1997 track, East Pacifica, previously heard on the Proto-Isness Fun radio broadcast. This is followed by a track of whistling and DIY percussion, a fun catchy piece which is still unidentified. The track list suggests it's Tangled Walker by This Is The Kit. It's definitely not that. Still, what's an FSOL mix without at least one unidentified track in it? Fatspat continues the run of FSOL exclusives, listed as upcoming on From the Archives Volume 6. Probably a typing error as it appeared a few weeks later on Volume 5. The outro is mixed alongside Downloads Were, a gorgeous ambient track.
I was lying naked on the beach in the South Seas. The tide was coming up over my toes.
the 1994 movie The Shadow, an example of a new bit of film dialogue. Another EMS piano track, complete with Osho narration, follows, along with a brief snippet of a then forthcoming Z-Box track, Lanes, labelled Stillness in the original tracklist. It's a very quiet ambient section, gradually bringing the transmission to a gentle close. Another section of environments is the final track, and its focus on synth sequences ties in with the hauntology feel of the opening section of the mix. The show closes on the Dead Cities tour favourite, You Were Right and That's Why Tonight. As a proper introduction to the Electric Brainstorm series, Volume 1 does a pretty good job, especially with the hauntology tracks near the start. That said, it's an unusually FSOL heavy mix, an absolute treat in 2008 with 12 unreleased tracks to sink our teeth into, but very uncharacteristic of the Electric Brainstorm mixes in hindsight. There's no clear atmosphere or overall feel to the mix, making it maybe less enjoyable to return to. Nevertheless, it's a fine mix in its own right, the start of FSOL returning to regular broadcasting, and something I listened to a hell of a lot of in summer 2008. The day before transmission, Brian sent me the cover featuring a buggy design clearly inspired by 90s artwork, although starring two girls who clearly aren't Shawneen. The name of the mix, with the 1 at the end, suggests a further run of mixes in the series. As a title, the Electric Brainstorm feels like a clear reference to the electronic brain. After the initial broadcast, the show was available to download on demand from the station and shared among fans as a bootleg. In November of that year, the mix was made available through FSOL Digital's Podroom section as Electric Brainstorms Volume 1. The odd pluralisation of FSOL titles is an ongoing factor in the FSOL Digital era. The mix is no longer available from FSOL Digital but can be heard on Mixcloud and YouTube. As always, you can find the track list in the comments below. The Amorphous Androgynous, Kazan, Russia, 30th of August 2008. The lack of promotion for Amorphous Androgynous gigs in the noughties still staggers me. A.S. Cobb, anonymous fan, friend of the band, maybe Mason Bentley himself, posted on the FSOL board in May 2008 that a Russian tour was happening in a few weeks. Brian confirmed to me that 4 shows were lined up for August. The only one I received any information about prior to the actual date, 2 days before, was the Moscow show on the 30th. Staggering, really. Kaz's interviews since have contradicted the facts we know, numbers, places, which only makes things harder to comprehend. The other things we really know about the Kazan show come from YouTube videos. It was part of the city's first Creation of Peace festival in 2008. The lineup of the Moscow show the following night was promoted as Cobain electronics vocals, Alicia Sufit vocals, Dave Sanderson vocal and percussion, Garry Lucas guitars, Virgin Howe drums, Baluji Srivastav sitar and vocals, Diane Harris video projections, which feels somewhat empty and indeed doesn't match the videos. The guitarist doesn't look like Garry Lucas and a long-haired bassist is present. The guy in sunglasses sits behind a second laptop and Jonathan Mayer makes his Amorphous debut on sitar. Still, either way, it seems like Mikey and Stu Rowe were very much out of the band at this point. The general sound and performance seems to match that of previous shows, however. Gaz sings along with the studio vocals and triggers various sounds on his laptop, with most of the electronics being played from the studio tracks. The bass and drums are live, the rest of the other instruments are largely decorative. Dave Sanderson does a lot of wailing at various points. The 31-minute YouTube video appears to be the complete show, with the setlist running to The Mellow Hippo Disco Show, The Lovers, Riders on the Circadian Rhythm, All Is Harvest, Elysian Fields, We Have Explosive. Mellow Hippo is in the usual extended version, once again changed from the previous live performances. The Lovers is fairly straightforward, with the guitarist attempting much of the soloing of it doesn't capture the excellence of the chopped up studio version. Alicia Sufit sings Let Us Love throughout the middle of the song, which is considerably more welcome than Dave Sanderson's Come On Make Some Noise nonsense at the start of the track. You're not Robbie Williams, mate. Riders is the only new piece in the set, and it's changed quite a bit from the studio version, with different drums, a longer intro, a different structure, and vocals from Alicia Sufit, plus guitar and sitar improvisation. It's clearly a favourite of the band's, appearing both here and on Electric Brainstorm 1, although not the most obvious choice for a live track, with the original not featuring any guest musicians and generally sounding as much like FSOL as it does Amorphous. Gaz does some odd dancing. He also appears to be bowing to Alicia Sufit. Maybe? I try not to think about this stuff too much. As live interpretation goes, it's one of my least favourites. It lacks the directness and simplicity of the album version. All Is Harvest features the All I Need Is the Air That I Breathe lyrics, but it's otherwise the same arrangement as the studio version. It's a track where the live performance does it some justice, although I'm not very fond of the vocals. Elysian Fields appears in its Abbey Road arrangement, leading into We Have Explosive in what seems like the most fun part of the set, despite Dave Sanderson's insistence on getting the crowd to make some noise. What's interesting about the set is how similar it is to previous shows, with Riders being the only new track. With 3 albums worth of back catalogue, it's odd that so few songs have ever ended up in the live shows. I did once hear a rumour that Galaxial had been played, God knows how, but otherwise, why not Yes My Brother, In the Summertime of Consciousness, Divinity, Meadows, The Peppermint Tree, Tiny Space Birds and so on. At this point it just feels a touch underwhelming. The Amorphous Androgynous Hermitage Garden, Moscow, 31st of August 2008. Advertised to fans 2 days before the show. Madness. The lineup was given as Gaz Cobain, Alicia Sufit, Dave Sanderson, Garry Lucas, Virgin Howe, Balaji Srivastav and Diane Harris, which is incorrect, as a bassist is clearly visible in the fan videos and Garry Lucas was almost certainly not there. No full set list is known, although it's likely to be very similar to previous sets based on the handful of poor quality YouTube videos available. One YouTube comment suggested that the performance lasted 90 minutes. The tracks heard on the videos are The Lovers, All Is Harvest, Riders, High and Dry, The Prophet, Elysian Fields and We Have Explosive. At least High and Dry is different to previous shows. As for the other 2 Russian shows in August 2008 by Amorphous, who knows? Gaz Cobain, Reworks Festival, Thessaloniki, 20th September 2008. Gaz's first DJ set in 3 years at 2008's Reworks Festival in Greece. Fans found out about this one day before the performance. I might have made my point by now, but if you're a Greek fan, how are you possibly expected to see this? Gaz later posted a video on his YouTube channel with some footage of his set overlaid with tracks played. While very familiar Miles Davis and David Holmes cuts are there, these sets does seem to have featured a lot of previously unplayed tracks. The Future Sound of London, Electric Brainstorms Volume 2, The Pod Room, 15th of November 2008.
Future Sound of London.
Okay, let's go.
5, 4, 3.
Transmit.
FSOL Digital.
I'm including this here because of when it was made and intended to be broadcast rather than when it finally came out. The second Electric Brainstorm mix was first announced in June 2008, just over a week after the first volume. Intended to be broadcast by PBS in Melbourne, Australia, the link between the band and station was made by Stephen Harron, aka FSOL digital artist Seafar, a friend of Brian's from Glasgow, now living in Melbourne. Unfortunately, the extensive 3-hour show was eventually considered too long for broadcast in a single block, and the station asked to transmit it as 3-hour-long mixes. Communication eventually broke down and the mix went on hold. In November, Harron provided the FSOL board with a full track list with more than 60 tracks listed, several of them simply named Environments 2. Had the show actually been broadcast in August as intended, it would have acted partially as a promotional mix for Environments 2. Not sure if I prefer the way things happened, with the album being a musical surprise, or if I would have liked to have had all these teasers. Certainly the tracks played would have really upped the hype and excitement for that album. As is typical with these things, one track labelled Environments 2 remains unreleased, and A Corner appears not to have been part of the album at that time. That or the others were unnamed at the period the mix was completed. We're still in the 96-97 tour era when it comes to a lot of the spoken samples. For a show with the task of promoting Environments 2, it actually opens on a track from Environments 3. Heartsick Chord had, of course, been recorded as part of the San Monte tape sessions for the 2006 Lifeforms 5.1 surround exhibition soundtrack. Still an interesting choice, although it's quite possible that it hadn't yet been confirmed for inclusion on that album. A brief spoken word environment, including a tiny snippet of the Amorphous track Carousel follows, and then it's an Eno and Cluster track first included on the very first Kiss FM transmission in '93, overlaid with the Delia Derbyshire and Barry Beaumont. It was a foreign voice spoken section from Dreams, as also heard on Kiss FM shows. Then it's some mellow IDM from Physarum, surrounded by works by some of the world's most important figures in electronic and tape music, a snippet of collaborative work by Pierre Henry and Pierre Schaeffer, a piece by Pauline Oliveros, inventor of the deep listening ambient concept, and an excerpt from Luc Ferrari's third groundbreaking Presque Rien. Early experimental compositions were an occasional part of the band's 93 Kiss FM transmissions, and they've remained a reference point through to the present, regardless of other styles that have come and gone. He knew more about what I was going to do than I did, an Apocalypse Now quote used throughout the 3D Headspace tour was overlaid. After an advisory circle hauntology track first heard on the first Electric Brainstorm, the It's My Mind That Works sample from Repo Man is included. The more experimental tone returns with a Nurse with Wound track overlaid by the burbling electronics of early tape music composers Herbert Imert and Robert Bayer, with Amorphous-esque Osho speech on top. This eventually makes way for an EMS piano track, The Suitcase, with those early analogue synthy AKS tones. It could easily have come from the early days of electronic music itself. This eventually resolves into Serengeti from Environments 2. Intriguingly, when The Suitcase was released in 2013, it retained the Serengeti flute loop in the background. It closes with a bunch of environments including spoken word, children's laughter, the applause from 565. Then things take a left turn into the flute-led instrumental prog of Focus, although to keep things from getting too amorphousy, what sounds like film footage is played over the top for the most part. It crossfades to a really familiar ambient section, although as much as I rack my brain I can't identify it. Some Stephen Jesse Bernstein ranting about being mesmerised by the hopelessness of logic from classic ISDN follows, and then another unknown track from the lo-fi analog synth sound. It's either something from the early 70s, cluster-esque, or a modern artist aping the sound. Unfortunately, Shazam seems incapable of differentiating between artists using synth sequences, and it offered numerous suggestions for the track, none of which were remotely correct. Ennio Morricone's Ninna Nanna Per Adultery is the second track to be replicated from the first EBS mix, with the They Gets to Missing What They Had, They Get So Lonely for High Scrapers in the video sample from the Kiss FM transmissions over the end, only slowed down somewhat. An Eno Burn track is up next with some monstrous psychedelic bubble mix samples afterwards. These make sense, followed by Bruce Hark's early electronic pop song Electric to Me Turn follows, a wonderful mid-ground between the monstrous bubble sound and the early electronics of the Electric Brainstorms. More experimental pieces follow, industrial noise from Throbbing Gristle, experimental voice and cello composition by Morten Feldman, and a wonderfully bleak poem by Andy Fairley. Kind of daft to compare the Kiss FM transmissions and essential mixes with the Electric Brainstorms, with roughly 15 years separating them, but it is remarkable to hear the difference between them. At this point there's very little interest in sounding contemporary, if such a thing really exists in the internet era, with modern tracks thrown in purely through quality and given equal placing alongside early tape music, avant-garde composition, industrial, 70s ambient and 80s underground music. The overall tone is far more experimental, darker and noisier than the 90s mixes, with FSOL being very much not part of any scene in any sense at this point, and with electronic music having developed massively in the intervening 50 years, this is unsurprising, yet it's fascinating to compare the two eras. Much of the music used in the mix is very much in line with Brian's FSOL digital releases like Handmade Devices, Four Forests and Seabox 1 and 2, with Gaz's psychedelic and prog interest thrown in for variety, so it all fits perfectly with the era. Up next is some more 60s groove music, and yet another duplicate from the first EBS mix in the form of EMS Piano's The Vessel. Greed is Good, Greed is Right from the film Wall Street appears, also first heard on a monstrous psychedelic bubble mix. Then we get two tracks from the 1997 Proto-Isness sessions, Gyrated, listed here as Somewhere, and Exchanged, heard for the first time since the 1997 Peel session and listed under its working title Tudor Oak Manor Farm. The latter was warmly welcomed by fans as an eagerly awaited unreleased track. Then it's on to more hauntological synth music by Mary St John, yet another EBS1 track in the form of its C-Box's then unreleased Lanes. A gorgeous track by 90 Degrees South follows, and I've spent the last 13 years telling myself I'll check out the full album. Maybe tomorrow. Then it's back to early electronics with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop member Malcolm Clark's charming Bath Time. Then there's a sample of William Defoe as Jesus Christ in The Last Temptation of Christ, not a sample previously used, but a film that was sampled heavily in their earlier transmissions, particularly some of the monstrous bubble ones. Further experimental rock music comes in the form of the dub-leaning Twilight Circus dub sound system and Tarokoko Rot, a group who would also feature on the third EBS mix. Then there's a track by Brian's father Bill, recorded during his work for the Scottish Film Board. There was talk of an album of this material to be released through FSOL Digital, but it's yet to surface and seems unlikely at this point. Some environments, two environments, that's an awkward phrase, closed the track before a run of further experimental pieces. Works by GRM member Bernard Parmigiani and electroacoustic composer Gordon Mumm, and John Cage's legendary Imaginary Landscape No. 1, sits alongside more modern analogue sounds of Mordant music, as well as releases from acclaimed labels More Music and Static Caravan. An unreleased C-Box track, the rhythmic Open Head Surgery, the full-length version of Newfoundland from Environments 2, and Till We Meet Again, an outtake from Yage's The Woodlands of Old, add an FSOL digital slant to this section. Till We Meet Again also features the Imagine stripping a woman down and she has a body like a little submarine, Bukowski quote first heard on the inaugural Monster Psychedelic Bubble transmission. It's astonishing that after a 75-minute album there were still more unreleased tracks from the Woodlands of Old sessions, yet another leaked as part of a torrent a few years ago. Cage's piece is the oldest known track on an FSOL mix dating to 1939. The Static Caravan track is Robin Saville's Colin the Lazy Cormorant Part 1, which deserves mention for its title alone.
Following signal is recorded equally and in phase on both channels and should provide a central image.
It's a sample of what sounds like an early documentary or demonstration of stereo sound from the early days of hi-fi equipment. What next? More hauntology from Ghostbox artist The Focus Group, some seriously creepy psychedelic soundtrack music from Ronald Stein, and some twee folk from Vashti Bunyan, an artist with an FSOL link. Her comeback album, 2005's Look Aftering, was produced by Max Richter. Then more early electronics from DBD Derbyshire, and a collaboration between the two powerhouses of experimental music, Faust and Nurse with Wound. Then the previews of the third Z-Box album continue, with the vocal Conceal Them, listed as Minimal Wave in 2008, likely after the genre the track inhabits. It's followed by an odd piece of 70s library music, and a wonderful live cover of Aphex Twin's 4 by experimental rock band the Coma Lilies. The final hour of the mix focuses largely on more modern music, from the brutal minimalist techno of Pansonic, the woozy IDM of Proem, more hauntology from Belbury Polly, and experimental rock from The Land of Nod and Sunburn Hand of the Man. Three friends of the band also appear: Roll Funken, Dan Pemberton and Second Thought, the latter being my second appearance on an Electric Brainstorm mix. Brian seems to really love Street, the track included, while I reserve the right to think it's not one of my best tracks. Oh well, it's always a real honour to be included. There's also an answer phone message, seemingly from the woman used in the Galaxial Pharmaceuticals message samples. The rest of the final hour is set aside for FSOL digital material. Environments 2 is further represented by a corner and an unreleased guitar-led track with the Girl Screaming from Hyde Park field recording, more from Bill Dougans' Clyde Port Authority soundtrack, two previously released from the archives tracks of Distant Nebulous and UU, samples from the band's sound design for Pete Fowler's Monsterism Island concept, another then unreleased version of Yage, a final preview of the third Z-Box collection, and the still unreleased archive FSOL track Turned. There's very little in the way of movie dialogue, as with much of the mix, although the number of the Future Sound of London stings increases dramatically at this point. I suppose I've got to stop people pirating the new tracks. There's a brief snippet of dialogue and Foley from Escape from New York, as well as 96-97 tour favourites take sample there, Will You Wake Up for 1 Minute, Open Your Eyes, Open Your Ears, as well as the 1994 Apocalypse Now sample, You Can't Travel in Space, You Can't Go Out in Space. The final minute features an extended version of the closing environment to Herd Killing. As a listening entity, Electric Brainstorm 2 is a tricky one to sum up. Ultimately, it's too long to simply just pop on, and requires a serious block of time to set aside and pay close attention to everything that's gone on, which is how the mix works best. The heavy use of experimental music from the 50s to 70s, combined with the continuing inclusion of Ghostbox artists, extends the ongoing hauntology feel of the FSOL digital era. While the appearance of IDM material is intriguing, the more complex IDM style developed in the late 90s after the band stopped working on electronic DJ mixes, effectively making this a previously unheard sound in the FSOL catalogue, with only hints at it coming from the band's own experiments of the style on Dead Cities. Because of these shows' length and its release as a single 3-hour file, I haven't listened to it anywhere near as much as the other Electric Brainstorms, but it's hard to deny that it's an incredibly effective set that fares brilliantly from quite abstract sections to full-on bursts of energy. I wouldn't even like to think how long was spent on constructing this show. The mix was eventually released with the opening of the Pod Room a few days after the tracklist was shared in November 2008. The Pod Room itself had been teased a few months earlier as a home for mixes, transmissions, podcasts and live streams. The name is inspired, tying in with the 1993 track and being a room for podcasts. As the only new mix in the pod room upon its launch, although the Kiss FM broadcasts were unheard or incomplete as bootlegs, it was very much a highlight of the launch. As with the bulk of the pod room mixes, it has since been removed from sale, but can be heard on Mixcloud and YouTube. Sadly, the idea of live streams through the pod room never took off, and fans are still eagerly awaiting the first use of live web streaming, which in itself should really be one that's completely at home in the world of FSOL. And that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. There was a lot to take in here. Do let me know what you think of this. I'd love to hear what you think of the Yage album, an incredibly overlooked and underrated record in the band's catalogue, probably the studio album that's been heard by the fewest people. Do let me know your thoughts down below. There are also like, subscribe, share buttons. You already know the deal by now. I will be back next week with the first instalment of the Is This the New FSOL album series? Something that continues to this day. I hope you'll join me then.